You know, as a sounding board for unsolicited hobby advice, I hear a lot of people talk to me in person. They tell me that, you know, their painting has reached a ceiling. Their painting doesn't seem to get better no matter how many hours they stick into it at the workbench. And if that was a little bit too elaborate and fluffy sounding, what I mean to say is people often walk up to me and say that they wish their painting was better. But the way you're asking me, I just use hard lighting and a smoke machine to make it look better. And I avoid giving advice across the board in general with filming, camera, audio, miniature painting, because my advice is usually pretty stiff, and then no one ever asks me for advice again. But my advice for this kind of thing, specifically for painting, when I get asked or told about it, is the response is a question. And the question is, what are you painting for? Because painting to get better at painting is very different to painting to get something done. Painting to get better at painting is better than painting for the sake of it just because you enjoy it. And it's certainly very different to painting it because you just got a new release and you're excited to just sit there and do some hobby with it. So we are back to that question of what are you painting for? And that can be a very powerful question if used right and used honestly and asked toward yourself. And what are you painting for is basically how you learn to establish a brief. We've talked about briefs in the past. I've talked about it a couple of years ago, but that was a couple of years ago. So I'm going to talk about it again. So I'm used to a brief. I do briefs all the time. I worked as a creative for nearly 2 decades and always had a brief. Sure, the brief is initially very short and on paper, but ultimately it is very flexible. There's room to discuss the brief. There's room to spitball ideas, but what the brief ultimately does, and very, very usefully does, is tell me the point of the end product. A brief doesn't tell you every specific detail of what you need to do in your workflow or how you do it or how you want to do it or whether you can enjoy it or not. A brief pretty much says, we're starting from nothing, this is the end thing, let's make it happen. Now, when I sit and paint for myself outside of the channel, if I'm doing a piece of music that's just for me, if I'm making a little video that's just for me, instinctively, I will give myself a brief, which is probably a tool that a lot of people don't have. And that's not a shoot on people. That's just something you have to have when it's been your job for a long time. Though I don't sit there with a pen and paper necessarily. Most of the time, 90% of the time I don't. But if I've got a box of toy soldiers in front of me, I'll say, right, there are 30 troops, 2 characters, 1 tank. Okay. So we're going to pick a base coat, normally a color or a paint specifically that I'm familiar with. I know I can either dry brush it on or it will go on in 1 coat to save time. We're going to do our knickknacks with contrast paint, and then we're going to pick a universal wash to go on at the end. And I need to remind myself that I need to weather that vehicle separately from everything else before the end wash goes on. We're going to highlight the main primary color for the army, not a lot else. And then we're going to spend probably a couple of extra hours on the characters, just giving them a bit of spit shine. That is my process of giving myself a brief. I've asked myself, what am I painting for? And the answer is, I want these done in 2 days, and I want them in a game at the weekend. If you have an idea for the 30 block of troops, it's 2 characters and the tank, well, work your idea into the brief. How does my idea fit into a logical workflow that's going to get these done in 2 days? That's a brief, essentially. Now, the opposite approach to this would be the red dragon that I recently painted up on the channel. With that, I knew that I had to test a load of new variables for a paint range that I'd never used before. So before I started doing anything, I knew that I had to do a base coat, some airbrushing, some dry brushing, some stippling, wet blending, and layer highlights with a good selection of the paints. And I knew that the red and the gold were going to have to work together with each other because that's what I needed to show off. But absolutely none of that video was planned, none of that project was planned, save for that 2-minute conversation I had with myself at the start. There's reds, there's airbrush, there's dry brushes, there's the gold paint I'm going to get in at some point. I need to use the coal black, so I'm going to use something sympathetic to the coal black so it doesn't feel completely out of place. Right, and we got 24 hours, let's go. That was it. But again, there is another time where I had to say to myself, what am I painting for? The first example, painting for a game at the weekend. Second example, painting to show off all the different kinds of paints that were in this set that you can buy. Second one's a unique example, but you can kind of turn that around and use it for yourself. Think, well, I want to learn how to paint grey fabric. Okay. So you've got your Death Korra Creed characters. Everything else is completely ancillary apart from their grey coats, which you want to put some effort on, learn how to paint grey. So focus your brief around that. And while this approach will not give you the best painted thing that you've ever painted ever, Lord knows it doesn't for me, but it does give you a win. It gives you a little victory on that incessant grind set of trying to better your painting with every model. Probably isn't going to happen a lot. But what does happen is that you achieve something you set out to do before you started. Ergo, a little victory or a little win. I'm not going to say this will work for everyone, because if you're just painting and enjoying every second of it, then you're a happy painter, you lucky bastard. But if you're getting to the end of a painting project and feeling a little bit empty and like, well, I could have done that better, could have done this better, it's worth trying this approach, because yeah, you could have done it better, but you can say to yourself, yeah, but I did what I meant to do. That's a win. Here's another one. So a little while ago, it is a while ago now, but I'm going to use them as an example with these He-Man models that I wanted to do two things. I wanted to get better at painting and blending skin tones, or at least push myself in this example, but I wanted to maintain primary colours and pop that I'd seen in the cartoon. So that was my main focus. He-Man I spent about 2 or 3 hours on. Skeletor was another couple of hours. And Skeletor gave me the largest playground when it came to working with primary blue. And the rest of the characters took about 6 hours, because I'd done what I wanted with the He-Man and the Skeletor, and the rest are pretty much just there for playing pieces and to facilitate getting that game on the table. But I have seen it in the MS Paint's Patreon and Discord quite a bit, is people say they physically can't stop themselves from painting to the best of their ability, which is entirely fair. But my counter to that is that working to a brief isn't necessarily dialing back on your quality, but it's making choices, not necessarily concessions either. It's about making choices early on in the process. And when you make those choices early on in ideation, I find they're much easier to stick to as you progress through the project. So if I told myself I wasn't going to paint highly detailed worn leather belt straps on my Space Marines, and it gets to the point where I'm about to paint the belt, I don't then immediately paint highly detailed worn leather straps on my Space Marines. I stick to what I said and just do that. And some people might say, well, yeah, that kind of takes the fun out of it. Yeah, yes, it can do, but if you're already not having fun, or you're already stressed about your painting, then where's the harm in, taking another 3% of fun out of it? Again, this doesn't work for everyone, but most of the highly productive painters I know, I'm not going to name any names because they will just appear in the comments and tell me that I'm wrong and completely undermine me, but most of the very productive painters I know will definitely be working to a brief, whether that is colour, whether it's the tools they use, or whether it's the deadline that they want to get it done by, and therefore everything else works around that deadline. Yeah, they all use it, and they seem... Actually, no, they don't seem happy, do they? So yeah, if you're finding yourself butting up against that wall, and you're asking yourself, why doesn't my 3,000 point Imperial Guard army look absolutely gorgeous and stunning under a macro lens? Ask yourself, what am I painting for? Well, the more I say it, it feels like a metaphysical question, and we're not going down that road. But yeah, give yourself a fun little brief, because sometimes it is quite nice to work within a box and a framework that you've established before you let your brush and your paints run away from you. Thank you to my wonderful Patreon community for being their wonderful, lovely Patreon community selves. I will see you next time on this channel for something. Cheers. I'm out of here.